Started.
Thank you, Jenny. There's always a moment when someone reads the bio where you're like, oh, I should probably just cut it off right there. Like that's the well, thank you all for attending today. I mostly kid though. I mean, the reality is that I am a long way from where I thought I was going to be all those years ago when I started my graduate education at the University of Chicago. I didn't think I would be someone who would come back when I left. I thought, I escaped the rigors of U Chicago and was catapulted into, the professional world as a public policy writer. And after about a decade, I realized I couldn't stay away, and I've been back since about 2019. So it's great to be with you all today, talking about stories and about how to do this kind of work, both in a policy atmosphere, but also in the kinds of documents that you're preparing for graduate applications, for job applications, for scholarship applications. So before we dive into it, let me make sure I share my screen because I am terrible at remembering to do that. Okay, there we go. Now, what we're going to talk about today is kind of it's going to be a look behind the curtain of how really effective policy stories tend to work. We're going to start with a little what might feel like creative writing training. But if you stick with me, you'll see exactly how we can apply this in a public policy environment or a public policy atmosphere. I am totally fine with being interrupted with questions. If you have something, put it in the chat. Jenny's going to monitor the chat. If there's something that we need to address, she'll let me know. Otherwise, I'll save some time at the end too to answer any questions you might have. So please feel free to wait until the end if you have something you'd like to discuss. Maybe it's even more specific to your example or to your instance of what you're hoping to achieve at Harris. Hopefully, fingers crossed. This will give you a little sense of what it's like. So let's just dive right into this. We'll start talking. We'll figure this out along the way. And like I said, hopefully this will demystify quite a bit of the process for you. If you've ever taken any creative writing training, or maybe you know something about theater or about writing movie scripts or any of these sorts of kinds of writing projects, then you've definitely come across Aristotle's dramatic arc. This is about 2,500 years ago. Aristotle wrote the Poetics, which was a really interesting take. It was really an analysis of the most important and most impactful stories of Aristotle's time. And what he found was that those sorts of stories had similar elements in that they sort of met the audience's expectations in specific ways. And so the way that the dramatic arc gets dissected now is into these different sections, right? So we have this opening scene. Sometimes I call this the inciting event, the thing that kicks off the story, that starts the journey, that could be either something that a character does or a group of people do. Maybe it's something outside the control of the characters, like a pandemic or a natural disaster. Something is going to happen, right? And so once we get into that opening scene, we're setting the stakes for the story. We're being clear about who the main characters are. And then it's that building of tension, right? It's that the little progressive complications that build that help us really understand the most important conflicts that are happening in the story, the way that the story is developing until it gets to this climactic moment, right? Where the main character has to make some kind of decision, has to do something to resolve the plot. And then we get the denouement, right? The French word for untying the knot, which I think is a great way to describe a conclusion to a really effective story. So if you want to imagine the opening scene tying a knot into a string, right? And over the course of the story, you're untying the knot. This is the Aristotelian sort of formula for an effective story. Now, I should say that this is, I'm being very clear that this is Aristotle, because this is also what we would consider like Western tradition of storytelling, right? It's very focused on the individual. We have the sort of individual versus another, the individual versus self, the individual versus nature, the individual, right? All these sort of conflict-based story structures. Now, that's not the only way to structure a story by any means. And there are really incredible kind of traditional story structures that come from the East, that come from the Middle East, that come from Africa, that we explore to a certain extent here at the Harris School, just as like interesting ways to elicit certain kinds of reactions or certain kind of emotions. Because storytelling is so deep in our psyches. It's so who we are as human beings, that when a story sort of has a familiar rhythm, or it has a sort of structure that we're familiar with, that's going to lead to a more pleasurable interaction, more fluency with the subject matter, more coherence, more understanding. This is why storytelling is so persuasive, is because it helps us really see, it helps us understand what's really happening. The difference between a story that has a narrative arc, or a story in the Aristotelian tradition, and just anecdotes, or just a scene, or something that happens, right? The big difference between those different things is that a story is going to show transformation. A story is going to show change. It's going to show transformation, growth, improvement, something, right? Something has to be different at the beginning. That's how you know you have a story. If nothing changed, then you have a piece of information, or you have an anecdote, but not necessarily a story. So this is what we had, basically for 2,500 years, was this understanding of how stories tend to work in sort of meeting these 5 essential elements that are going to help meet those expectations of the average audience member. And then right after World War II, an interesting development occurred here at the University of Chicago. This is a little known story about a pretty famous alumni of the university named Kurt Vonnegut. So Kurt Vonnegut is most famous for writing the sort of science fiction-y type novel Slaughterhouse-Five, which takes a very fictional, like I said, science fiction sort of approach to telling the story of the American firebombing of Dresden, Germany at the end of World War II. Now, the accounts vary, but tens of thousands of German civilians were killed during this bombing, anywhere between 60 and up to 200,000 potentially German civilians were killed. Dresden didn't really serve any sort of military significance. And it was also a place where the German military was stationing American prisoners of war. And Kurt Vonnegut was an American prisoner of war, and he survived the firebombing of Dresden. 2 decades later, he writes Slaughterhouse-Five, sells it for $1 million, catapults him into literary fame. But before all of that, right after the war, he came to the University of Chicago to study anthropology and to study social science. And he had this idea, he had a hypothesis about what he called the shapes of stories. And he thought that he could look at stories from across the world, from across different cultures, different time periods, and that if you really looked at the structure of those stories, they would fall into one of 6 kinds of stories, what he called the shape of stories. And the way that Kurt Vonnegut thought about stories was really like in a graphical form. He pictured sort of a line graph depicting how a story progressed. And the way he thought about it was on a time scale, beginning, middle, end, but also what he called the fortune scale, from good fortune to bad fortune. And these 6 kinds of stories were what he thought dominated all storytelling known to humankind. Well, his advisors at the University of Chicago didn't think that his thesis had much merit, and they weren't very supportive of that being his research project. And so he dropped out of the university without completing his master's. Well, then fast forward, 2 decades after Slaughterhouse-Five has become, this enormous commercial success, this literary success. The university then asked Kurt Vonnegut if he would come back and submit one of his writing pieces for his thesis, and the university would grant him the degree, because they realized that there was something to what he had hypothesized. Now, that was in sort of the mid 70s when people were starting to recognize these shapes of stories. And the story that Kurt Vonnegut was sort of most passionate about, or the one that he thought had the most potential to really impact a reader and to change the way that they understood the world, was what he called a man in whole story. And the thing about these stories is, he says, it doesn't have to be about a man, and it doesn't have to be about a hole. That's not the point. This is just a shorthand to describe the shape of the story. And so when he depicted this kind of story, like I said, in a graphical way, it started to look like this, right? At the beginning, you have a character that's experiencing fairly good fortune, maybe something even good happens to them, and then all of a sudden, their fortune takes a turn for the worse. Something happens to them, or they do something that has a result that basically puts them in the bottom of a hole, metaphorically. Now, I've actually met people who I've told this story shape to, and they say, well, my story's about falling in a hole. And it's like, okay, well, then this is the perfect story structure for you, because it's literally about falling in a hole. But you don't have to literally fall into a hole, right? The hole could be the pandemic. The hole could be police violence. The hole could be a professional failure that you experienced. It could be some sort of traumatic experience you had as a young person. It could be anything that sort of gets in the way of you accomplishing your ultimate goal. Sometimes writers call this the object of desire, right? What is it that the character wants? What are they trying to achieve? Now, this works in both a personal storytelling capacity, right? So if I say, how did I end up at the University of Chicago? Oh, well, I had this idea, and I thought that it could help make the world a little bit better. And I realized that the people that were doing that kind of work, they all had MPP degrees, and they came from graduate programs that were really quantitative focused, like the Harris School. And I haven't had math since my freshman year of college, when I took a psychological statistics class, and they let us use all the formulas in a notebook, and we didn't have to memorize anything. And that's the last time I did any statistical analysis. So, that's my hole, right? Is the fact that I'm not ready to do the kind of work that needs to be done to make a real impact and a lasting change in a policy space. Now, in a story like that, it's not actually the bottom of the hole that is all that interesting, right? Sometimes people hear this structure and they go, oh, you want me to just like tell you everything bad that happens. No, that's not what I'm saying exactly. What I'm saying is, tell the reader about a situation in which the results you were hoping for went the other way, right? You were in some kind of a hole. And it's not the hole that's the interesting part. It's the how did you climb out of the hole, right? It's this right side of the graph where we go from the trouble or the ill fortune, and we're climbing out of the hole. We're getting out of it towards the end. It's actually that part of the story that has the most impact. And that's that part of the story that oftentimes gets the least amount of attention. Right? There's this misconception that a story is about sort of how did we get into trouble, and then quick, how did we get out? I would encourage you to quick describe how things got into trouble, and then spend most of your time describing how you got out of it, right? Because it's the how did you accomplish your goal, or how do you plan to accomplish your goal? That is what the reader's really looking for. Right? And maybe part of climbing out of the hole is coming to the Harris School. Maybe part of climbing out of the hole is building a coalition of organizations that are all working in your area of interest, and getting them to all focus on pushing one piece of legislation to be passed, right? It could be that you needed to rely on other people and not try to do it all yourself, right? Maybe there's someone that was standing on the edge of the hole for you and was reaching down and helping pull you up. Maybe you climbed out totally on your own. Maybe the hole lifted, you know, with you, with your community, as the people you were down in that hole with sort of, you know, dug themselves out of the hole. Whatever that structure is, it can sort of be graphically depicted this way. Now, the reason I'm spending so much time talking about Kurt Vonnegut in the story structure is that once you see how this works, you will start to notice this everywhere. It's sort of like when you learn any kind of trade or craft. You know, when I was in college, I worked as a carpenter. It was a great job. I loved it. And I was a finish carpenter, so I put all the trim up around the windows and, you know, along the ceiling, and because that took really exacting, precise work, and that's just my nature. I'm exacting, I'm precise. It also, I think, what makes me a good researcher and makes me a good communicator is I don't let things hang on the wall crooked. Right? I don't let the trim, you know, match up like this. It has to be like this, right? And there's a certain amount of pride that comes with understanding a craft like that, right? And I think once you start to see communication and writing in that way, you will start to appreciate good storytelling in a different way. You'll also start to notice what makes a story less effective, right? And it could be a variety of things. It could be that the balance is out of, there is no balance in the story. Maybe you're spending way too much time on the bottom of the hole and not enough time on, well, how did you get into the hole and how did you get out of the hole? Maybe you're thinking about a story that you want to tell where you're still in the hole and you haven't quite figured out how to get out of it yet. That doesn't mean you shouldn't write that story. It just means that part of the ending of the story is there's a lot more work to be done, and here's the plan moving forward, right? So you can start to see how this might be used in a personal storytelling way, right? You're applying for a graduate program, a scholarship, a job, an internship, whatever it is, and they're going to ask you that question, right? Tell me about yourself, or how did you get interested in this topic, or you know, what is it about public policy that you're so passionate about, right? And you could do what I did in my bio, right? Which is like, hi, my name is so and so, and I'm from here, and I have this degree, and I did this work, and I came from there, and blah blah. You can do that, right? Or you can tell that story of, well, how did you go from studying forestry to studying history and art to ending up in public policy? How did you do that? Well, I have a story where I was in the bottom of the hole and I had to climb out of it, right? How did you end up at the University of Chicago? There's a story there where I was at the bottom of the hole and I had to climb out of it, right? All of these stories have some sort of obstacle or challenge or issue or barrier, something that got in the way. Because if something didn't get in the way, then again, there's really not much of a story there. There's nothing that changed, right? So now imagine this kind of structure. Maybe you are applying for grant funding for an organization that you're working with, right? And they want to know, well, what's going to happen if we give you this money, right? What's going to happen to the people that you're trying to help with this money? You can tell a story about a man in hole, right? A man in hole story shape. Now, the other thing that I really like about this structure is that it inherently plays into this concept that I've been doing a lot more reading about in the last couple of years about asset versus deficit framing. This is a totally fascinating area of research if you're interested in policy communication. But to put it simply, if you frame things in a deficit way, right, this would be like saying the young people on the south side of Chicago, you know, are high risk for engaging in violent crime and have a lower chance of graduating from high school. That's framing things in terms of deficits, right? There's a lot of violence on the south side. Graduation rates aren't as high as they should be. Those are deficits. If instead we frame things frame things as assets, right? If we say, what are our, how might we help young people achieve their dreams of, doing whatever it is that they want to do after they graduate from high school, right? Then you start thinking about people in terms of the skills and the assets and the aspirations and the potential that they bring to a given policy issue, and not just the deficits, the challenges, the issues, the barriers, those things that can oftentimes backfire for us to focus on. So when we write a grant application that basically says we're the saviors and we can fix all the problems, and that can come across as sort of like, oh, well, without you, then these people would fail. Is that what we're saying? And even if that were true, right, in whatever way that you were dissecting your data or your evidence, it still takes away all that agency from the people that you're trying to communicate about. And taking away agency, taking away people's power in that way doesn't make it a more attractive narrative for people to want to help out in terms of, a grant funding situation, right? You can start to see these cynical responses from people of, well, we gave this grant to this organization that promised they were going to do this and they didn't accomplish that. And so that must mean that whole, effort is pointless. And that's definitely not, I'm sure, what the people who wrote those grants would want the conclusion to be after reading. Then if you think about this from a more sort of client focused, or like, you're working as a professional communicator and you've got to reach a general public, or you've got to reach a specific decision maker, again, using a story structure as a way to help bring coherence to chaos, really, right? A lot of policy issues are very chaotic. They're complex, they're nuanced, the problems are wicked, they have lots of causal factors, right? You're not going to be able to just instantly solve things with a great story, but you can help people understand a situation better with a great story. And if we understand situations better, if we have more evidence-based understanding of things, that would lead to better decision making. If just having better decisions or having better information was enough to lead to better decisions. And it's oftentimes not, right? It's not just what's the best information, but what's the best way to get someone to feel a specific way about that information. And a story like this, a story that has a shape, a man in whole shape, leaves a reader oftentimes feeling much more empowered, much more hopeful than they would if the story ended at the bottom of the hole. Now, there can be some critiques of this kind of approach, especially around topics like climate change that are, there's definitely progress to be made, but there are definitely going to be, bad outcomes, and we're already experiencing a lot of those, and there's plenty of reason to believe that those will get worse. And so there's some people who say, well, just, highlighting, the incremental progress that we're making on climate change isn't enough. Or, talking about the incremental progress we're making on social justice is actually a moral failure, right? It's taking too long, this incremental technocratic policy change. And I totally understand that point of view. I really do. I think because I came from the federal government, I was there for about a decade, we had to have a much more pragmatic approach to solving certain kinds of problems. It was better in so many cases to get small changes to make things a little bit better than to get no change at all. So I think that's definitely my bias when it comes to communication and policy analysis, is I'm more likely to take that route that's going to lead to some compromise, some understanding, some coordination, and an acknowledgement of shared reality. And an acknowledgement that we're all in this together in a meaningful way. And stories have the power to do all of those things, right? Stories have the power to break down barriers between people, to help build empathy, to show how people that are not like ourselves, how they live and how they think about the world. If a simple, reciting of facts was enough to do that, then that's all, that we wouldn't need to tell stories, right? We could just give everyone a one-page fact sheet and then they would instantly believe everything we believe. But we just know it's not that simple. So framing things in a story can be sort of like a way to ease into a discussion, right? Because you're meeting the expectations of that reader in terms of, you know, what they expect next in a story, right? If we tell them about a problem, then they're going to want to know how that problem came to be. They're going to want to know what's causing it. They're going to want to know what we think should be done to address it. They're going to want to see, how did other people climb out of this hole? How did other countries climb out of their hole? How did, you know, 100 years ago, how was it done, right? Think about all these interesting articles that have been coming out. I've seen over the last few months, especially since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, looking at agriculture across the world and food scarcity, and looking at ways of going back to traditional agricultural practices that were seemingly more sustainable. And then you have other folks on the more technological side that are saying, no, it's you know, genetically modified crops are the future, and we have to go in that direction. And to me, this is all a matter of who's going to tell the more persuasive story, right? Who's going to paint a picture of the future that more people are going to want to live in. Because so many times what I see in policy writing that's good but not great is that it doesn't help us imagine better futures, right? It helps us understand how bad the present might be, or how we got into such a bad situation, but it doesn't always go that next step of saying, okay, and here's what we can do next, and here's what the future might look like if we do these things. Because imagine how difficult it would be to convince anyone to sacrifice anything if you couldn't convince them that their sacrifice was going to be worth it, that the sacrifice was going to lead to a better outcome. I mean, if we can't do that, if we can't imagine a better future, then how could we ever expect anybody else to go along with us on that journey? So this is where the man in whole structure can be really, really persuasive in a specifically in a public policy context, because it acknowledges reality, right? It acknowledges the challenges, the barriers, the issues, the deficiencies, the systemic challenges, whatever it is, but it doesn't fall into despair, right? It doesn't end with lack of resolution. The story ends with either, and here's what we're going to do next, or here's what we know is working and we're going to keep doing that, or here's what we know is not working and we're going to stop doing that, right? There's something that ends the story. Now, when you come to the Harris School, and you should all apply because we're amazing and you'll have an amazing time, but when you come to the Harris School, what you will learn is that in policy, there is basically only 3 kinds of stories. Now, I know this is getting a little bit like, there's a lot of numbers here. So we have, like, you know, Aristotle had 5 pieces of the narrative arc. Kurt Vonnegut had 6 shapes of stories. Well, the Harris School, we have 3 types of policy narratives, right? The 3 types: descriptive, evaluative, and prescriptive. Most policy writing has descriptive elements, right? It's really important to be able to say, here's what's happening, here's what happened, here's how it happened, right? All those descriptions of reality, right? Really, really important. Oops. Then we have more evaluative questions or narratives. These are the kinds of narratives where we're telling a reader what seems to be working or what doesn't seem to be working. And then in a prescriptive narrative, we're actually telling the reader what we think should be done next or what could be done next. The difference between an evaluative narrative and a prescriptive narrative, there are a few differences, but the main difference is in an evaluative narrative, the research has already been done, right? The randomized controlled trial has been done. The meta-analysis of the research has been done, and we have some kind of consensus around what the research tells us, what the implications are, whether something is effective or ineffective. In a prescriptive story, though, we're talking mostly about implementation. We're talking about collecting evidence to solve a problem. So whereas an evaluative narrative might be, you know, evidence-based policy, a prescriptive narrative might be better described as policy-based evidence, right? So if you know that you're going to have to deal with a certain problem in a given policy area, and nobody's tried to solve that problem before, or no one's tried to with any success, it might be beneficial then to look to other disciplines or other policy areas for ideas on how to solve that problem. So one really quick example I can give you of this is several years ago, I was working with a student group that was working with a client from the state of California. And in the state of California, they have goals to reduce their carbon emissions by a certain amount by 2030. And now this has become a lot more common. You see this, but California was one of the first places to do this. And so the group that the students were working with, they basically started with a blank slate. They were like, okay, what can we do to help the state of California reduce its carbon emissions? And they started looking at all these different ways that carbon is emitted. And one thing that really jumped out to them was how much carbon is emitted through the meat industry in California. So not just the raising of beef, but the slaughter, the transportation, the cooling, refrigeration, all that stuff, right, leads to big amounts of carbon being emitted. Well, they said, okay, well, how do we get people to eat less meat? That became the policy challenge, right? And it was like, well, people have tried, public service announcements, the Meatless Monday campaigns. Maybe there are ways of incentivizing people to buy vegetables and fruits. Maybe there are ways of disincentivizing meat production. You could tax it, right? But like, these are things that California had not tried or had not done. So you start looking around and you go, well, New York City tried to ban large sodas. How did that work? Other industries have had their products banned, like tobacco, right? You can't smoke tobacco inside in the United States. How did that work? How did that policy change occur? Right? You can look for insights from other places in a more prescriptive kind of narrative. But that's really what differentiates an evaluative from a prescriptive narrative. Now, the best kind of narrative might have all three of these components to it, right? You can imagine a story that follows the man in whole structure, where you say, this is what's happening, here's what the whole looks like, here's how we got into it. The evaluative part of the narrative is, these are all the things that have been tried, right? We tried to build a ladder, we tried to climb out without a ladder, we used a rope, we tried all these different things. What we found was, this strategy seems to work the best. Okay, well, how are we going to scale this up? Right? How are we going to make this kind of intervention work for a bigger population, right? That could be the sort of policy narrative that follows that exact shape. And when it follows that exact shape, what's going to happen with your reader is instinctually, kind of in the back of their mind, they're going to go, oh, this is like every other kind of story that I've read that has this kind of shape. And they're going to get to the end and they're going to go, wow, I feel this way about this story. And you will not have had to tell them explicitly how to feel. Just by reading the story, they will come to a conclusion. And if you're a strong enough writer and good enough at really anticipating how your reader is going to respond to your writing, you can essentially create a very specific experience for them through your writing. So this is where we start with policy writing at the Harris School, is what kind of narrative do you want to tell? Then once we know that you want to make some kind of recommendation for political reform or for policy reform, then what we start doing is we start looking at, okay, what are the pieces there that we need in order to really be persuasive? And again, this ties back to the same shapes of stories, right, that Kurt Vonnegut's talking about. So to make a persuasive recommendation, we need 4 things. We need to be able to tell people what's happening. We need to be able to tell them what should be happening. We need to tell them why there's a disconnect or a divide between what we want to happen and what is happening. And then the effect, we also need to talk about the future. What might happen if we take a certain direction or if we take a different direction? To be able to prove your point, these are the different things you're going to need in a narrative. So let's take a look at some of these things, like how does this actually work, right? We have the condition. We know we're talking about the description of what's happening, right? This is where we're talking about history. We have data and evidence. Maybe it's case studies, randomized controlled trials, whatever the evidence is that's going to tell us how big this problem is, how widespread it is, whether it's getting worse, whether it's getting better, if it's staying the same, right? All of that context is so important, not just for a policy decision maker, but for anyone who's reading your applications, your personal statements, right? They want to know, how did you get interested in this? What is the data and evidence from your life that shows us you're ready for this rigorous graduate education, right? What part of your story shows us that you understand the implications of the problem that you're trying to solve, that you understand the key stakeholders and the key players, right? That's what I mean by moves, impact, and counter moves. So much policy analysis is about, program outcomes, or looking at what happens because of a certain regulation or a certain intervention. And we sometimes fail to talk about all the people that are doing certain things, right? Like, what is the leadership doing? What is the Congress doing? What is the president's office doing? What are the state legislatures doing? What are the, other key stakeholder groups? What are they advocating for? Who's on whose side, right? Who has power? All of these questions are really, really important to understanding the condition, understanding the situation. That's where most of us spend most of the time in policy analysis and in communication. It's just figuring out what's going on. Really, really important, but only one piece of the overall puzzle. So another piece that sometimes gets lost is in really thinking about criteria. And what we mean by criteria is we need something that tells us what should be happening. It can come from lots of different places. It can come from, very concrete sources like laws, regulations, statutes, charters, mandates, did I say constitutions already? Anything that is sort of codified, contracts even, right? Anything that is codified and says, this is how people have to behave. That can be criteria. If you're writing a policy brief and you find a problem that is contrary to what should be happening in a law or regulation, you've got a really clear-cut case now to say this is what's happening and it should not be happening according to this regulation. But what if you're writing something more personal, or you're writing something for a client that, maybe there's not a law or regulation that relates to it? Well, this is where missions, goals, strategic plans, objects of desire, whatever you want to call it, that's where that can come in, right? So maybe your goal is to be able to work with machine learning to make the risk analysis tools that law enforcement agencies use less biased and more egalitarian. That could be your mission. So what are you doing to achieve that mission? Right? Well, you learned programming languages and you interned at a company that is a startup for, AI tech used in law enforcement. And now you realize you really want to understand the policy and the law side of it. So you're going to come to the Harris School and do a joint program with Harris and the law school, right? Very clear of what you want, what you're trying to achieve, what's important to you, and very clear in how Harris can be a part of that. Right? Same thing with a policy decision maker. When you lay out a problem or a challenge, an issue, a deficiency, a barrier, and then just say, okay, that's it for me. I'm out now, right? If you're not there to say then, okay, here's what we might be able to do about it, or here's what we think the goal should be, or here's what should be the most important thing. These are things that need to be debated oftentimes, right? Is it more important to be environmentally sustainable or to be socially just? What if you can't achieve both? Which one gets priority? Right? These are the kinds of discussions where policy analysts and communicators can make a big difference just by sort of enforcing transparency, right? In saying, what is it that we really want to accomplish? What is it that we're really trying to do? I just read a piece, sort of a longish article about community policing efforts in Chicago that a colleague of mine at the Harris School is writing. And I got done reading it and it was so well written. It was so wonderful to read. Clearly very intelligent person wrote it. clearly knew what they were talking about, understood all the data and the evidence, understood the history, all of that. And I got done reading, and the first thought I had was, well, what was supposed to happen? Right? There's this certain amount of I call it the curse of knowledge, right? Steven Pinker calls it the curse of knowledge. I stole it from Steven Pinker. He probably stole it from someone else, but don't quote me on that. But the idea, right, is that once you're an expert in something, it's like it's impossible to remember what it was like to not be an expert. It's impossible to remember what it was like to not understand. So when we aren't clear about what should be happening, right? When we're not clear about what we want to happen, then we can sort of confuse our readers without even really knowing that we're doing it, right? Because it seems clear to us what the goal is. It seems clear to us what the stakes are. But unless we make that clear to a reader, it could go right over their heads. And then the last chunk of sources of criteria, I call these best practices. Again, these are not rules or regulations, but there are management best practices, auditing best practices, leadership best practices, lots of things that we know are evidence-based or that are, accepted by the government or are, standard practice across nonprofits, those sorts of things. Those can also be things that you highlight as criteria of how something should be done. When you talk about best practices, though, the best thing I think to do is make sure that your audience recognizes those as best practices or that they respect the authority of those best practices. And if they don't, that just means you have a little bit more work to do, right? It just means that you have to do a little bit more work showing them why those are best practices and why it's important to do those things. For example, I years ago worked on a report that was looking at how many women served on corporate boards in the United States and what their representation looked like on corporate boards. And after crunching the data that we could find, the answer we came up with was about 16% of corporate board seats have been filled by women. And this was like in 2011. So hopefully that number's come up a little bit. But one issue we ran into with that narrative was that we didn't have any clear criteria that we could point to that would say, you have to do this, right? Because we were a federal government organization. We didn't have authority over private sector corporations in any way whatsoever, right? So we could say only 16% of seats are filled by women. And all the corporate boards that we got data from could say, yeah, that's okay. Right? And so if we say, well, that number's too low, the natural question, the response would be, well, what's the right number? Right? How do you know when you've reached the right number? And this is, again, where we can add a lot of value to a conversation by getting clear about what it is we want. So we heard lots of different ideas. We heard things like, well, the corporate board should reflect the customer base. This is something that Target is doing in the United States. Target Corporation, the last time I checked, this was a couple of years ago, they had, it was like almost 40% or 45% of their board seats were filled by women, but their customer base is like 60% women. So they still have a ways to go if they want to have a representative board. We know from other kinds of research that the more diverse your board is, it's correlated with higher profits. That might be a really important piece of criteria depending on your client, right? What if you're working for a corporation that's seen its profits lagging, and they're sort of like, well, we don't really know what's going on. It could be that a more diverse board could lead to better decision making, could lead to better outcomes, could lead to bigger profits, whatever that goal, mission, desire is, right? So really thinking about how you can be helpful, how you can provide guidance, how you can advise without having to say, I'm the expert, I know everything, this is the right way to do everything. Nobody knows all that information. I don't know all that information. I like to think of, I have a friend who's Buddhist who told me this this concept, and I can't remember the exact terminology for it, but he basically said, it's the idea that nobody really knows what they're talking about we're all just pointing at the moon and saying that's how you get there. Now, I'm not quite as right. Like, yes, we're all just pointing at the moon and saying that's how you get there. It's obviously a lot more complicated than that's how you get there, right? You don't just point, you actually have to, fly millions of miles through space to get there. But it's that idea that we're all just trying to do our best. That's a thing that I try to remind myself of when it comes to working with my clients, working with the groups that I'm writing for, is that understanding that people are trying to do the best job they can. Now, how they understand their job, that can sometimes be where the causes of some of the issues start. And this is why I spend a ton of time with students really looking at the cause. I'm sharing this picture because I'm like secretly super proud of it. Because we have like no pictures of the writing program whatsoever, and it's like, how do you take pictures of people writing? It's not, and so we were like, well, we should show the brainstorming stuff that we do with students. And so this is an exercise that I do all the time called affinity clustering. And what we do is once a group of students, they have their research and their evidence collected, and they have a pretty good understanding of what is happening, right? The condition, the description of what's happening. We start dividing that evidence into these different categories: condition, criteria, cause, and effect, right? So what's the data and the evidence that's telling us what's happening? What's the data and evidence telling us what should be happening? What's the data and evidence telling us what's causing the condition, right? And we're not just talking about causal inference, we're talking about contributing factors, correlations, anything that can lead to the condition. So if you imagine, the condition is here and the criteria is over here, and there's that gap, there's a divide between the two. What is contributing to that? That's what's gonna be mentioned in this part of the story. And then the last part of the story, that effect statement, and this is one of our very wonderful writing fellows. Her name is Patricia, and we were doing a brainstorming session on a policy brief that she's working on, looking at the most effective ways we know to teach empathy to elementary age children in school. And so we were brainstorming this, and it's a topic that I don't need a lot of convincing. I think we could all stand to learn to be more empathetic. I have young kids, and I try very hard to model empathy and to point out empathy and to reinforce it as much as I can. But when Patricia and I were working on her narrative, I said, well, what does it look like if people are more empathetic? Like, what does it look like if we are able to teach children to be more empathetic? How would the world look in a world like that, right? How might things be different? And I'm never asking anyone to write a science fiction novel. I'm not asking you to write Slaughterhouse-5. Now, if you can write Slaughterhouse-5 and sell it for $1 million, please don't let me dissuade you. Please do that, and then let me know, and I will pre-order a copy, because that's how you make sure you get $1 million advances. You have a lot of pre-sales. But I'm not asking anyone to write science fiction. What I'm asking you to do is paint a picture of that future that I or your reader might be willing to sacrifice to achieve, right? Why should we get down in the hole with you? Why should we get down there with you and climb out? What is it about you and your mission, your goal, your team, your program, your initiative, whatever it is? How can you help us, as the reader, feel like we're a part of that journey, that we're learning something with you along the way? That's what a really important story is going to do. And so it can be as simple as just brainstorming, right? Like, what does it look like to live in a society that lacks empathy? It's not that hard to imagine. So what would the opposite of that be? What would a gradient, just 50% better be, right? Or 20% better? What would that look like? Coming up with some ideas, especially related to your audience, right? So if Patricia is writing this for an audience of teachers and administrators who are deciding what kind of curriculum to implement, or what kinds of reading materials to include, or what kinds of videos or whatever they want to use in the classroom, then she's going to want to paint a picture that's attractive to that audience, right? Maybe it's less disciplinary issues in school. Maybe it's more respect between teachers and parents and students. Maybe, and then what does that look like, right? Maybe it looks like fewer teachers burning out and leaving the workforce. Maybe it looks like more, the people that have the passion and the talent to teach. It makes it easier for them to become teachers. Maybe there's lots of different ways that teaching empathy could manifest itself in society. And we can do this for any sort of policy issue, right? If we say that we want to have, cleaner energy, okay, what does that look like? Well, depending on your audience, you might want to focus on the economic benefits, or you might want to focus on the clean air benefits. If, let's say, you're communicating with an audience that has, been marginalized and has had, toxic and dirty enterprises built up all around them that is poison the water and the air. Well, cleaning up the air and the water might be a really, really attractive story to people who have suffered that way, right? So thinking about the different pieces of your story, the pieces that fit into the shape, right? From starting with good fortune to ending up outside the hole, this is where you're showing the assets, the skills, the aspirations, the agency, the power of yourself or the people you're writing about, right? You're showing them that they're not beached at the bottom of the hole waiting for someone to rescue them. They're in this hole and they're climbing out, they're doing something, they're trying to make the world a little bit better place. And where that story ends on the fortune scale, so either leaves the reader thinking, okay, we've made progress, but there's still a long battle ahead, but we're making progress, or it leads them to think, oh, there's nothing that we can do. This is pointless. And I don't know about you, but I would rather have that first reaction than the second reaction. That first reaction of, we're making progress, but we've got a long way to go, is different from, nothing matters, so let's just fight till the end. That's not very inspiring for most people, right? Nothing matters, so let's just die fighting. That's not very inspirational. The idea that the future could be better in some way, that's what can inspire a reader. So I'm always looking to stay in touch with like-minded folks, especially anyone who would agree to spend an hour talking about the shapes of policy stories and how to be a more effective storyteller. Please feel free to find me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on there. Reach out, you can connect with me. I'm on Twitter, but I hardly ever tweet. I mostly use it to follow professors and researchers that I really admire. And I also have a web page and a newsletter that if you sign up for, you can see, when I write something new or I've got something cool going on. But I do mean it. Stay in touch. I firmly believe that, we're all in this together. I really do. And I think better storytelling can make a huge difference in so many of the policy areas and issues that we're passionate about. So thank you for spending this time with me. I see we have a bunch of chats that I did not look at, Jenny. So
it's fine. The chat was a little, we had a lot of requests for the recording and the slides. So before we get to Sonia's question, I see she has her hand raised. So anyone, if you have questions either about the application process or a question for David, please go ahead and put that in the chat or use the hand raise feature in Zoom. But this session has been recorded and we'll typically have those recordings in a few days. So email harrisadmissions@uchicago.edu early next week, and then you can have the recording to this session. And David had done a masterclass with us last year as well. So if you found this really helpful and you want more of that content, we can send you the masterclass from last session as well. Just go ahead and ask. So, oh, and Jess, my colleague Jess just entered in the chat, harrisadmissions@uchicago.edu. Sonia, let me go ahead. You should be able to unmute and ask your question.
Thank you, Jenny. Thanks, David. I think this was a lovely session. My question is basically, I know we covered a few different forms of writing and you took us through the whole thing. I think when you mentioned about the man in the hole story and our graduation application should be around how are we climbing out of that hole, I think you also spoke about the persuasive recommendation. So I'm having a little trouble understanding how do you blend the two? Like, where does that, like, how do you climb out of the hole and also share the condition, criteria, cause and effect? How does that come into play?
Sure. No, so I can see where the yeah, because what I'm essentially trying to do here is I'm trying to say the difference between a personal statement and a policy brief can really just be about who you're writing it for and what you're trying to achieve, right? So with a personal statement, you're writing it for someone like Jenny, right? Who's going to review it, and what Jenny's going to do and her team is going to do is they're looking for people that that are prepared for the rigors of a Harris education, but who are also going to really benefit from the opportunities and the experiences and the classes and the networks that we have at Harris, and you're going to go on and do something really important and interesting, right? That's what, I mean, this is, maybe Jenny will never say this, so Jenny, don't, you can look away if you need to, but like graduate schools want to be able to brag on you, right? They want to be able to say, look at what our great things our graduates are doing, right? And yes, it's helpful for us in recruiting and admissions and inspiring people to come work with us, but it really is a genuine interest of ours to really help prepare the next generation of policy leaders. And so if you're thinking about your specific journey as a man in whole shape or a person in whole shape, right? The climbing out of the hole, right, could be part of the Harris experience for you, right? You're coming to Harris not because you're desperate, right? Being in a hole doesn't mean you're desperate. It means that you have steps you have to take to get to a place where you can do the work that you want to do, that you can have the impact you want to have. Very similar kinds of structures in a grant application, like if you're running a nonprofit, right? Very similar in that we have this goal, we're going to address this issue, we feel really confident in how we're going to do it, but we need your money, right? That's a very standard kind of application for foundation. Now imagine you're doing something slightly different, right? You're writing a policy brief, maybe a white paper, something where you want to make a specific policy recommendation. So the purpose has changed, right? The purpose is not to get accepted or to get the scholarship or to get the grant. Now the purpose is to describe something, evaluate something, or prescribe, right? That's where we go to the 3 types of narratives. So if we are going to write a policy brief where we want to make a reform proposal, right? We want to say something needs to change to address this condition that we found. You can imagine structuring a story like this where we say, here is what happened, right? Here's the condition. Here is what that led to, right? The condition led to essentially the metaphor of being in the hole, right? We have a problem, whether it's, lack of access to clean water, or it's malnutrition, or it's, police corruption, or, whatever the policy issue is. That's the hole that we are in as a community or as a society or as a world. And so then the question becomes, all right, if we can all agree that we're in this hole, now how do we climb out of it? That's where the recommendation comes in, right? The recommendation is, how do we get out of this hole? How do we show that we know the steps we're going to take to get out of the hole are actually going to make a difference? I think that's the biggest barrier that we have as communicators, is not that we don't know what to do, but that we're not always confident enough in such uncertain times. We're not confident enough to say, this is our best foot forward, right? And I have to imagine that if you're going to apply to a graduate program, in the back of your mind, that's what you're thinking, right? Is you're thinking, this is the best next step. This is the best next thing for me to do. Is it going to solve every single problem? No. And it's probably going to create a bunch of different problems that you had no idea about, right? But it's that making progress, showing transformation, showing growth, showing sometimes that the thing that got you here, right, where you're getting ready to apply to a graduate program like this, or you're getting ready to submit a policy brief to a important decision maker, or you're getting ready to submit that big grant application, is you have to feel certain, even with all the uncertainty, that this is the next best step, right? And when you can convince someone through, showing them what convinced you, right, that this was the next best step, that can be really, really persuasive. So when thinking about how to apply this shape, this story shape, the thing you're always going to hear me say in class and in workshops, and I know I've said it here, and I know I said it in the other masterclass last year, is your audience and your purpose really matter, right? Who you're writing for and why you're writing for them, really, really important. The point, though, is that this shape can be used to satisfy multiple audiences and can be used to serve multiple purposes.
David, I want to add a note to Sonia's question about kind of applying this to the personal statement. Something that you said in the last session that I was like I literally thought you might have seen a light bulb appear over my head, because I've used it over and over again, was the throat clearing language. So,
Yep.
So often folks, like to David's point with the man in the hole story, sometimes you've got to write that part out where you're telling me all about the hole and how you fell in it and how deep it is. But we really want to know the how you got out part. In a previous session, David referred to that as throat clearing language. Some advice I give students is, after you write that, go back and just cut that throat clearing language out and take me, and then you can have more space to build up the end. So David, that was your term. I don't know if you have anything to add on to that, but all the time.
That's a really great way, if I do say so myself, so I think what happens sometimes, and I'm guilty of this too, is that you start writing and it takes a couple paragraphs sometimes before you go, oh wait, here's where it all started, right? Here's the line that, and usually what will happen to me is I'll write something, or if I'm working with a student, I'll read a line that they wrote, and I think, oh my gosh, Jen, this is the first line right here. Like, you start right here. Now, how do I know that? How do I know when I've read a good first sentence? Well, a good first sentence is going to do one of three things. A good first sentence is either going to throw the reader right into the action, right? So if my first sentence was something like, my heart beat up into my chest when the officer pulled me over, and you're sort of like, whoa, what's going on here? You're right in the middle of the action. You're not really sure. The reason a narrative like that, a beginning like that, can be really impactful is because it hooks the reader, right? It brings them right into the heart of the action. Now, what you have to do with a story like that is you have to very quickly explain what's going on, right? Because otherwise the reader is going to feel like they're kind of out in the ocean, just drifting, and they're kind of looking around and they're like, all right, what's going on? I'm in an ocean. I'm okay with this for right now, but eventually somebody's gonna have to pull me out, right? That's with a story, when you pull the reader out is when you basically back up and you go, okay, here's how we got into this situation. That can be a good way to start. Another good way to start is more, I hate to use the word background, but this is like, it is kind of a background sentence where you're telling the reader something that they must understand before they will understand the rest of the story. So usually you'll find in sentences like this, words like usually, actually, right? So you'll see someone write something like, usually when I went to school on Mondays, I would do whatever, right? But this day was different. That's so you're setting up the reader that something is about to happen, right? You're not throwing them right into the deep end of the pool. You're kind of walking them in from the shallow end, but you're eventually going to get to the deep end, right? And then the last kind of sentence, and this is the hardest sentence by far to write in a short piece, is what I call the setting sentence. And you see this a lot more commonly used in nonfiction books, in novels. In fact, you might have noticed I'm using lots of police related stuff, but I'm currently reading this book, right? It's called Occupied Territory, and it's about policing in Chicago from like the early 1900s until the 1970s. And it's written by an academic. It's really well done. And I can give you a good example of a setting sentence, because when he wrote it, I was like, I actually made a note next to it and was like, use this in a class someday. Where is it? Okay, I swear I'm gonna find it in short order. Anyway, the setting sentence is essentially when you are trying to give an impression of a place in time, right? And so it actually creates the most distance between you and the reader, because they have really no idea why you're telling them these things. But it's things like that. Here's an example. Acrid smoke hung in the air. It mingled with the smells of an urban midsummer heat wave. The dirt was damp. The streets were unpaved, right? Sulfurous odors of the manufacturing plants wafted. Animal smell, right? You're creating a scene through sensory description. This is not very common in policy writing, in terms of like writing a memo for your boss. You're probably not going to start with, on the eve of the first day of school, a brisk, summer breeze waft, you're not going to write like that. But in a testimony before Congress, you might. In an op-ed, you might, right? It all depends on audience and purpose.
Before we jump to some of the other hand raisers, David, we did have a question that came in early in the chat. So I want to go back up to that one. Sure. And Norkin asked a question. I wonder, how do you avoid being too pessimistic or negative in a story you are telling?
That's a great question. And I think, going back to asset deficit framing can be helpful in this regard. So if the policy issue that you're focused on is easy to describe in pretty like cynical or nihilistic or condemnatory ways, sea levels are going to rise, the polar ice caps are melting, nothing's going to get better, nobody's going to change. Those can be really, really hard narratives for people to process, especially people who want to take positive action, right? We call this the mobilizer's dilemma. So when you have an audience that recognizes that there's a problem and something needs to be done, they don't really need a lot more help in understanding what the problem is, right? It's sort of like, if you're like me and you check your news apps, right away in the morning, you go, oh, great, another horrible thing happened today. That's that effect, right? Is the another horrible thing happened. Now, if you have an audience that is looking for direction and looking for help on knowing what to do next, if you just come out and say, nothing we do is going to matter, right? That's not going to be very helpful. At the same time, if you have an audience that is maybe more free writing in nature, right, where they want to benefit from whatever's happening, but don't necessarily want to contribute to it, if you tell them nothing is going to change and nothing matters, then they're more likely to just say, okay, well, I'm going to, go live my life then, and I'm going to take care of myself and the people I care about. And that is also not a reaction that we want if we want to see policy change, right? And so what the research is showing us, this has only been studied for the last like 4 or 5 years. And so we don't have like full, complete understanding by any means, but there has been a lot of promise shown in telling stories where you are very clear about the risks and the challenges and the problems, but that the bulk of your narrative is focused on what I would call the helpers, right? It's the maybe it's about writing about an organization that's making progress, writing about a coalition that's building. Sometimes, like as a historian, or as a trained historian, I find a lot of hope in history. I know this sounds weird, but it's things like, when I'm reading about how policing, was taking place in Chicago in the 20s, there are a lot of parallels, right? And you start going, well, what did folks in the 20s do to make a difference? Did anything they do make a difference? You can sort of look to the past for advice, for guidance, for best practices. And so that's what I tend to do, is to either try to focus more on assets and less on deficits, and really show how positive change is possible. It's maybe a little bit like blues music. If you're going to come to Chicago, you gotta listen to blues music. It's the home of the blues, right? Maybe not the home, but a place where there's a lot of blues. Okay, here's what I appreciate about the blues. It just keeps going. It just keeps going. It comes from 5 different instruments with 5 different histories coming together, 5 different instruments that don't sound alike, right? Nobody expects the piano to sound like the saxophone, right? But both the piano player and the saxophone, like, they can both solo in a blues song, right? They can both do their thing, and they're appreciated for what they bring to the group. That's how I want my writing to be structured in its tone, right? I want the stories that I tell to say, hey, you might be a drum set and I might be a piano, but that doesn't mean that we can't play a song together. In fact, it means if you just play your drums and I just play my piano, it's going to get really boring after a little while, right? When we come together and we take turns soloing, right? It's that empowerment, that agency. I feel like if I can do that with my writing, with the stories that I tell, and hopefully I can inspire that in whatever, whoever my reader is, that oftentimes that's just the first step to having that next conversation, right? To having that next discussion, that next meeting. It's not about, is this going to save the world? It's about, is this going to get in front of the right person? Is that person going to want to talk to me after this? Is this person going to call me the next time they have to make a decision in this area because they want to know what I think, right? That's the kind of long-term relationship I think we need to build as communicators with our readers, is that we're in this for the career. We are transparent, we are honest, we don't pull punches, we're going to show you where our data comes from, right? Whatever the transparency, honesty, integrity, accountability, all of that. That's what I try to do with my writing. And it doesn't make me feel great every single morning to wake up and see, the policy issue that I'm really passionate about just got worse somehow. But also it helps me figure out what I'm going to do with my day, is how I'm going to keep working on that.
Okay, David, we have a few other hands raised.
Yes.
And we have until 9:30. So let me go through folks, and I can have folks unmute as we ask questions. So Buljat, let's see, you should be able to unmute and ask your question.
Oh yeah, thank you for very interesting and useful talk. I work with the Minister of Finance in Mongolia, and right now I'm doing my master's in policy economics. And I was thinking, I'm trying to prepare a policy note in my free time outside the classes. And actually, since the start of the pandemic, the government of Mongolia has started spending almost 10% of total budget for the child money every year. And it's going to be a burden for us. And I'm trying to write a policy note how we can, change these kind of things. So do you have any advice or recommendation in terms of steps to looking for and finding evidence, and what's the best example of these things?
Sure. Yeah. And actually, I think this is a good question, because it's the kind of issue that, doesn't matter whether you work for the Mongolian government, or you work for the city of Chicago, or you work for, some other organization. If there is ever a time when you're seeing the condition, right? You're seeing the conditions on the ground are troublesome, they're worrisome, they're indicating that some bad outcome might be on the horizon, then that is definitely a good reason to write a good policy narrative about it, right? And so then if I was going to write a narrative like that, my first most important question would be, well, what does my audience care about? So if I'm writing for the Mongolian government, right? There may be lots of competing needs or competing desires, right? This happens, anytime there's a crisis, whether it's, we, like in Chicago, there was money from the federal government that came in during the pandemic. It was pushed out to employers. We were trying to save jobs, right? And in that moment, it was like, all right, this is working. And now we look back and we're like, well, it seems like quite a few $1 billion, went to places where it shouldn't have gone, and there was fraud, and we got to go back and we got to fix this. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because those are competing needs, right? One is we need to get money into the economy to avoid catastrophic economic meltdown. The other is now we need to make sure that people aren't taking advantage of this system and that the incentives are better aligned now that the conditions are changed, right? And you can sort of look at these debates, if you look at them through the lens of criteria, right? What is it that we want? What is it that we need? What's the point, right? That's what I would want to know the answer to. So if you mentioned, we're spending this money, it's going to have some negative effect on Mongolian people. Is that the most important piece of criteria, or are there other considerations that are going into it as well? This is one reason why I really like when I have students from India in my classes, because the Indian government views these sorts of issues in a different way than the United States government does. And so I can give you like a little bit of a compare and contrast here. Maybe this will fill in some gaps too. So like in the United States, our focus is mostly on individual rights, right? So when we want to do something, we have to prove that it, won't violate someone's rights. And that's like literally the thing that everything boils down to, seemingly is my rights are being violated. Now in the Indian context, it's slightly different, right? Where they don't have individual rights in the same way that Americans do. They have sort of freedoms for, this is how it's been explained to me anyway, freedom for, or they have, a right to food, they have a right to housing, they have a right to educate, these different things. Nowhere in the United States Constitution does it say you have a right to healthcare or food or water or clean air or any of those things, right? So then in the Indian government context, again, the way it's been explained to me is that if you want to do something, some policy intervention, and it might take away someone's rights, you have to show that the benefit to the population is greater than the loss of the rights. So the loss of the rights is not necessarily the end of the conversation. Whereas in the United States, the loss of the rights is the end of the conversation. Right? It doesn't matter what the good benefits are. So when you think about how to frame a certain issue, it really depends on the political culture that you're communicating in, right? In the United States, we're much more keyed into ideas of equity, we'll call it, right? So it's like the hardest workers get the best results, for a simple way. Other cultures, it's more equality, right? Everyone should have the same. In the Indian government context, again, it's lots of times need-based, right? Do you need this or not? So again, thinking about the criteria, the way that you're framing a given situation, I can tell you too that trying to make people think strategically about the future is really, really hard. Human beings are not great at analyzing risk, just generally, and we're really not good at analyzing risks for things that we've never experienced or that have not been experienced. Right. So when we talk about things like catastrophic climate change, unless you have been in a catastrophic storm, it is really, really hard to imagine that happening to you. And we are also just primed to believe that maybe we'll be okay. Right. And so these are the challenges of communicating about future implications. Right. That's why sometimes when I gave that example of, teaching empathy in school, you could paint a whole image of what the next generation of society might look like, or you can focus on how would things be better next week, right? So a lot of it is just depending on your time scale, depending on what kind of criteria you want to highlight, what's most important to your audience. Lots of times too, maybe what they think is the most important is not the most important. This is where, again, really good persuasive communicators can make a difference, because it's not the data that's going to change all the time. It's the frame that we're using to describe the data, right? It's the way that we present the evidence that changes. So those would be the first sorts of questions I would ask. And then, really looking at what's your ultimate goal as the writer, right? If your goal is to get a policy changed, do you have a clear path for how that would be done? This is, I think, something that more political science type folks in that background have a little bit of an edge on people that come from economics or more like, other sorts of quantitative disciplines. It's just that, political scientists and social scientists seem to think about political strategy a lot more than economists do. But that's just to say, to be a good communicator, you really have to think about both.
David, thank you. We have a couple more questions in just a few more minutes, but I'm sorry if I pronounce anyone's names wrong, I apologize. Dayrai, you should be able to unmute.
Hello. Thank you so much, David, for such an insightful session. I think the Harris Writing Program is like one of the reasons I want to apply. Is really unique and makes like the MPP program at Harris really special. So my name is Dara. I'm a final year economic student at the University of Warwick in the UK. But yeah, I was born in Peru, so like not that far away from the United States. But my question is more related to how is the writing program at Harris? I mean, like, how are the session or like the workshop like during our like the 2 years? Maybe you can give us like a more like an insight about that. Thank you.
Yeah, and actually, this is some really exciting developments in this space at the writing program just in the last few months. So this spring, spring 23, we will be piloting a course for first-year students that will be eventually a core required course. So if you come to the Harris School in the fall of 23, so you'd be a 25 grad, you will be in the first cohort of students of MPP students that will go through the core requirement. We are very excited about this because it's going to be positioned as essentially a bridge course between the first 2 quarters of analytical analysis and the statistics, microeconomics, analytical policymaking. The core writing course will be in the spring. So what you'll do is you'll essentially learn your toolkit for 2 quarters and then learn how to translate that toolkit to a general reader in the spring. And then our goal, once you leave that course in the spring, is you are released into your internships, policy labs, client work, campaigns, whatever it is where you're doing real world policy analysis and communication, that you have the analytical tools and the communication tools to start making an impact right away. That's our plan for the next couple of years, is scaling that up so that we can meet the needs of all the MPP students that are coming in. In the meantime, we also are starting a couple of really cool initiatives this year. We're doing a writing assessment. It's an opt-in. We're piloting it with the EMP program, the Evening Masters program. So it's a small cohort of students, usually mid-career folks. The way that's going to work is they're going to get some instruction and an optional writing assignment, and then they can do it, and they will get one-on-one coaching with me or my team on not just what they're doing well and what they need to do to get better, but what resources specifically they should take advantage of while they're at Harris. So it's going to be very like hand in glove is our motto. We have accountability writing groups. If you have a special writing project, whether it's a thesis, a personal statement, a writing sample, come together with a small group of like-minded folks led by a writing instructor, make sure that you stay on top of those things. We have day-long writing seminars on different topics that are very special and small cohorts. We feed you throughout the day. You leave with the actual thing that we worked on. We have lunchtime workshops. We're about to stand up our public-facing webpage. I'm getting to look at some wireframes this week, but that's going to be a public-facing webpage with all of our writing tools, templates, frameworks, strategies, recordings from previous workshops, content that our writing fellows make, like all sorts of stuff, and it's going to be available to the public. Our motto is, you know, if the ship is sinking, you don't hide the buckets behind a paywall, right? You just start handing them out. That's our goal, is just start handing out buckets to anyone who wants to be a better communicator when it comes to public policy. So lots of exciting stuff on the horizon.
Okay, let's see. We only have, I think, just one more minute. So I was thinking, David, if it's okay for you, maybe Jeremiah could ask his question in 10 days and Fitsum could send it to the chat. That way we could make sure that we get an answer. Is that okay for, all right. Jeremiah, you should be able to go ahead and unmute to ask your question in Fitsum. And anyone else, please send them to the chat so we can get you an answer to that question. Save us a little time.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jeremiah. I'm a human rights activist, advocating for women and children. Presently, I'm pursuing international human rights law. I came very late, and I apologize. And I want to say thank you, David and team. It's about this storytelling. I could remember back home, the family, what they used to do. They gather the entire community like in the evening hours, and the person sat right at the middle, and a lot of people circle around, and they give out their story in their native. So it is very amazing, you know. And I know you have dropped out a lot of books on storytelling. You intend, my question here now is, do you intend to translate? Because I was fortunate to work in one of the international tribunal back home in Sierra Leone. I'm from Sierra Leone, the special court. I was the outreach officer for the special court in one of my districts, and there is a special tribe in that district. So what the special court did was to translate the book, the special court handbook, into that dialect, so that when we get into those communities, we talk to them in those books and we give those books out. So I want to know whether you intend to be doing that, because like in colleges, there are students, they are coming from different nationalities, but their parents could not read and write, but they can understand their own languages. So that those students may even have access to those books and take it back home and tell mom and dad, this is our own language, this is how it is interpreted.
I think that's a fantastic idea, Jeremiah. I'm going to tell my editor as soon as we get off this call, because I think you're exactly right. I have several very close friends that work in the human rights field, especially in Africa, and so I'm, you know, at least a little familiar with the type of work that's done there. And I think you're right. There is a real need to meet people where they are, not just with language, but with how they share information. And you're right that so many of us, you know, grew up in communities where storytelling was the way we learned. You know, that's how it was growing up in my family as well. I come from a family of storytellers. We joke all the time that's you know, get us around a campfire and we can tell stories all night. And they're all stories that have a meaning, right? They have a purpose. And it's not, you know, we don't get around a campfire and say, you know, did anyone see that interesting randomized controlled trial result that was published? And, you know, it's much more personal than that. And so what we try to do at the Harris School is bring together, you know, the evidence-based, technical, scientific, you know, sort of way of looking at policy, but presenting that in a way through storytelling that people are going to be able to really make sense of it, and to know that there is a need for folks, you know, outside of the English speaking world that want to take on and try some of these techniques. I'm super excited about that. And my mind's just going like this now of, you know, having students from Harris that come in with language skills who could translate some of these things and have them on our webpage and make them available. Like you've given me some really good ideas here, Jeremiah. I really appreciate that. And thank you for doing the work that you do, by the way. That's really important work.
Yes, thank you, David. A huge thank you to you for this session. I want to send one final note to everybody that this has been recorded, and we have other sessions with David that have been recorded as well. So if you feel like this was helpful and you want more information, just email harrisadmissions@uchicago.edu, and we can go ahead and send you the link to those sessions. I also sent a link to David's most recent book, Stories Are What Save Us. I listened to that. I found that incredibly powerful and meaningful. And for those of you who think maybe your essays are a point where you're just getting started on telling your story, I think David's book is really helpful for folks to really think about, you know, the longer story you might tell, you know, as a policymaker. So with that being said, David, any final pieces of advice or remarks for folks before we end this session?
Just that I'm really excited to, whoever ends up at Harris, really excited to help you tell whatever the next chapter of your story is. Thank you for attending.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day. Thank you so much, David.
My pleasure.
Bye.